Apex Legends Season 16 Reveille is turning the previous established meta on its head, and the weapons are no exception. The new weapon Nemesis might seem like the best option at a first glance, but after watching this video, you might think otherwise. Stay tuned to learn the worst and the best weapons to use in Apex Legends Season 16. Let's get right into it after a quick word from today's sponsor. But first, big thanks to Outplayed for sponsoring this video. Don't you wish you could capture every kill, win, or even death? Outplayed automatically records in the background and makes clips of, well, what you tell it to. Whatever you choose will show up on the timeline for your convenience, allowing you to look back and decide what you want to do with the highlights that you've decided on, including exporting small clips or even full games to YouTube. Whether you want to trim a clip and send it to the group chat or review your own dev to see what you could do better, Outplayed's got you covered. Outplayed supports over 300 games and the list just keeps getting bigger. Check out the link in the description and download Outplayed for free today. Let's start off the F tier and get all the bad weapons out of the way. These weapons are either must skips or are only good in very specific situations and should only be picked up for those situations and then discarded the second you get a chance. The first one of those weapons being the L-Star. It has a low damage per second, rough controllability, and an annoying gimmick which takes over your focus when trying to fry an enemy, not to mention that it uses energy ammo, which can be hard to get by as you head into the late to mid game, assuming people listen to this tier list. Because another energy weapon that I'll place in the F tier despite the possible pushback will be the Triple Take. It's generally only good for early game contests and getting flashy looking contests and quickscopes, but you'll quickly notice how useless this thing is the second you bring it into the late or mid game. It doesn't have much reliable damage at range, even when choked, and at the same time burns free of the aforementioned rare energy ammo per shot. If used as a shotgun, any shotgun will do a better job, and if used for sniping, any other marksman or sniper will do a better job as well. And honestly, let's just get most of the energy weapons out of the way early as I continue with the Devotion. This weapon should be good, but it just isn't. It's terrible when picked up and it's only worth using when fully kitted, but that requires a barrel stabilizer, purple magazine, a good sight, purple stock, and a turbocharger to actually be fully kitted. But if you somehow take the risk in carrying the Devotion throughout the early to late game as you pick up all the attachments, you aren't really rewarded for it because the Devotion still revs up with a turbocharger, meaning it has a lower damage per second at the start of a spray compared to the middle or the end, which means you generally will be out-traded by most other weapons if they're playing cover. You'll win if you fight someone in the open, but most of the time you won't be able to. Despite being a fun weapon to use, I just can't defend running it over anything else. Next up, closing off the F tier, we'll obviously have the Spitfire. It's large and bulky, it slows you down, and the terrible iron sights make it hard to aim before you actually get a sight. If you manage to fill it up with attachments, it still only delivers a damage per second of 162, which is nothing to write home about. It's actually more or less the same as an alternator, and Spitfire Crutchers might disagree with me on this one, but these Spitfire Crutchers rely on the enemy running out of bullets and then killing them with a larger magazine size, rather than with aim and damage, so I wouldn't place too much weight on their opinion. So let's move on with the D tier, and man, I can already tell there's going to be some angry comments after what I placed in the F tier, because with the reintroduction of hammer points, I consider the Mozambique and the P20 better than those aforementioned guns. Hear me out. While not really being used too much in BR, the Mozambique used to destroy in arenas. It has up to 134 damage per second with a purple bolt before you add hammer points into the equation, and if you do, it will deal 60 damage per pump against non-armored targets. So if you get close enough, you can one-clip an enemy by breaking their armor, and then two-tapping with flesh damage to knock them with an insanely fast fire rate. What is better is since the Mozambique technically is a pistol, your movement speed is almost unchanged to having your hands out, making you very difficult to hit. And if that still somehow doesn't sell you on it, the enemy definitely won't expect it. And honestly, the fear of dying to a Mozambique is more psychological damage than any other gun could physically dream of. And unlike the last time hammer points were in rotation, we now also have the Golden Bolt, which will make you reload just by sliding. The P2020 is the exact same, with the hammer points bumping it up to 27 damage per bullet against flesh targets. But unlike the last time hammer points were in rotation, we also have the laser sight, which improves the hipfire spread and makes hipfiring the P that much more viable. The last weapon in the D tier is one I'd love to place higher, but honestly this is the best I can do, and that of course is the alternator. Sure, it is pretty easy to control, it doesn't slow you down that much, and it can be fitted with a digital threat, but the damage per second is just so low, especially when compared to the weapons in the higher tiers in this video. So let's talk about them as we continue into the D tier. These weapons are decent, but I'd trade them up for the higher tiers as soon as I can. The first one of these being the Rampage, which actually found its way back into the ground loot this season, but as expected with coming out of the care package, the Rampage is no longer as strong, as it is no longer already charged up on pickup, and once again having the heat decay passively over time. In short, it was reverted to the non-care package version. And the issue with the Rampage is that it needs a Thermite to be worth using and is completely useless without it. Having a finite amount of space for Thermites and needing to be preemptive with the long charge up time leaves a lot to be desired, and the Rampage in the D tier. And we're continuing the tier with another energy weapon, this time talking about the Volt, which returned to the crafter this very season. The Volt is a solid close-range SMG that's pretty easy to control, but recently saw a nerf to its bullet drop and trajectory, making it a lot less viable over ranges. It may be easier to use than other SMGs, but it does have a noticeably lower DPS than its counterparts, and as such stays in the D tier. Next up is the EVA 8, and yes, I understand that this is a bit of a personal preference, but I genuinely believe that the EVA 8 is weaker than proper pump shotgun, since it just doesn't have the same punch that the Mastiff or the Peacekeeper brings into shotgun fights. It's good for wide picking and all-inning, but it feels more like an SMG than a shotgun. As with most of our shotguns, it did receive a buff to its projectile size in close range, but when it comes to this tier list, shotguns are sort of compared against one another rather than necessarily against all the other possible weapons. So moving on with another shotgun, still in the D tier, is the Mastiff. And I really want to put this higher in the video, especially with the buff to the projectile size, an addition to the stock this season, but at the end of the day, I can't justify putting it any higher. It still suffers from inconsistent damage, and requires the user to be extremely up close to outtrade other shotguns. It's a decent weapon to carry when looking for a Peacekeeper, but nothing you should keep as a secondary leading into the mid or late game. However, we're starting off the C tier with a better choice, that being the Peacekeeper. Due to the nature of shotguns, it will be hard placing any shotgun higher than a C tier along with other most secondaries, as that's really all a shotgun can be, a secondary. And not even a must-have secondary as well. That being said, if you are looking for a shotgun, the Peacekeeper is it, with very consistent damage combined with a choke for longer ranges, and the newly added tactical stock to make it even more viable as the game progresses. And before we head into the rest of the secondaries in the C tier, I just want to get the Havoc out of the way. And I have vouched for the Havoc before. It's a good, solid weapon with an easier to control recoil than most other weapons, especially as a jitter aim enjoyer, but it sadly falls short with the nerfs in the previous seasons, where picking up a turbocharger lowers its damage per second from 202 to 190. This forces the user to make a trade between a high damage per second or consistent damage, and generally it's just not worth it. This season, I would probably place the Havoc in the B tier if there wasn't a damage hit when using a turbocharger, or it came pre-installed with one to add a semblance of consistency. Not to mention, the 202 damage per second is a bit of a power creep as more powerful weapons have entered the meta. Now, let's rattle off most of the secondaries in the C tier, starting off with the 3030 Repeater. The 3030 is a solid gun with decent overall damage, but it falls short in controllability due to the heavy bullet trajectory. It also doesn't have a super high damage per second as far as marksman or sniper weapons go. It certainly packs a punch over range if you got nothing else, but it shouldn't be relied on in the later game. Because in this specific case, you probably want to leave it to the sniper rifles. One example of a C-tier sniper rifle being the Longbow, which was also put in the crafter this patch. The Longbow is a sniper version of the 3030 with decent controllability and a very high damage output, making for the sniper rifle with the highest chance to knock and finish an enemy, and since it can be equipped with more scopes, it is more likely that you get to kit out the Longbow than a 3030. Moving on and closing out the C tier, we have the Sentinel, which I personally would love to place over the Longbow, potentially in another tier due to personal preference, but when compared, I will concede that it is a matter of personal preference, and more or less kills versus damage, where the Sentinel is more beneficial for the team's economy with less ammo used per damage, plus a stronger trade and potential higher damage surprising the enemy with turning it into a mini Kraber with shield cells. But the Longbow is more detrimental to securing kills on enemies in the open, which ultimately is what you want with the sniper playstyle. So let's dive into the B tier with a few more long distance weapons that are in a tier above the former ones, starting with the G7 Scout. The G7 has to be the best option for marksman rifles on the ground, packing a heavy punch of 128 damage per second with up to 20 bullets per magazine, allowing you to put down a lot of damage across all ranges. The double tap aids with longer range sniping as well, allowing you to put down consistent damage on teams that are much farther away. It wins in most trades, assuming you can keep your aim steady on your target as you tap away. But many could argue that when it comes to sniping, consistent damage is key, which is why the charge rifle is considered one of, if not the best sniper on the floor. This is the only hit scan weapon in the game, meaning it has 0 bullet trajectory and 0 bullet time. Just point and shoot, you'll deal instantaneous damage. This is especially useful when catching enemies in the open, but it does fall short when trading damage with other teams using other weapons on this list. It also takes 2 sniper ammo per shot, so you need to carry a lot of ammo to make it worth it. But if you have good center position, a lot of ammo, and a chip on your shoulder, you can turn this weapon into a massive damage and potentially even kill farm. As for the next 4 weapons in the B tier, I'd argue that all of these are viable. If anything, they're more or less the same level. Some excel at different ranges, but they have overall the same impact, and it all comes down to your own and your teammates' playstyle, which fits the most. So let's start off with a really close range, that being the Prowler. This weapon has been disregarded for a long time as a controller-only weapon, as it has a low overall damage per second, but a very fast beam with consistent aim. The Prowler was recently buffed in the previous season, upping the damage by 1, which doesn't seem significant, but in reality, this means that you can kill a red armored enemy in as little as 3 bursts. The Prowler being a burst weapon allows you to play cover and only peek when it's time to shoot, reducing the time you expose yourself in CQB, and can be equipped with a laser sight to make that hipfire more deadly. Moving on with a slightly farther range is a weapon that is still very reliable across all ranges, despite its removal of the anvil receiver, that being the R301. Yes, it did receive a nerf to its damage per second, going from 189 to 176, and the hipfire spread has been nerfed, but it's still very easy to control, and you're more likely to see full use of its damage per second than with some harder to control guns, such as the Prowler SMG that I've mentioned previously. And if you're more of a fan of a slower, slightly harder to control, but higher damage per shot weapon, look no farther than the Flatline. Obviously, it has lost some versatility with the removal of the anvil receiver and, of course, the hipfire nerf, but it is still very viable as a versatile mid-range weapon, and honestly, despite the nerf, the Flatline's hipfire spread isn't even that bad. Because of the R301 nerf, the Flatline actually has a slightly higher DPS than the R301, but it is a lot harder to control with a harsher recoil, so it will come down to whichever you feel like using. Again, these last 4 weapons in the B tier are all more or less of equal value and comes down to your playstyle and your personal preference. This also rings true for the Nemesis, the 4th weapon out of this group, and it's just drastically overhyped this season. Now, don't get me wrong, I've already dealt with this on Twitter. It's not a bad gun, but it's definitely not broken or overpowered as some people make it. The Nemesis has a DPS between 180 at 0 charge and 196 at full charge, and it shines at medium to longer ranges due to an easier controllability, but it is ridiculously expensive to maintain charge with, not to mention how bulky it is to constantly pre-fire it and to make sure you got the gun charged up and ready to go at a moment's notice. For example, if you get surprised by an enemy and you haven't charged up your gun or anything, you're just going to die. I can see how the gun can be strong when the conditions of having full charge, the enemy being caught out in the open, and having a lot of ammo from a good position are met, but it's just rare. Again, the stats are there and some people wish to buy it, but if I want a mid-range AR, I'd look towards a Flatline or R301 that still has more versatility and works in more situations, rather than when all the stars align. Moving on, while one could argue that all weapons in the B and A tier are viable, I do want to give some extra attention to the A tier weapons, as they do still remain one fold above the rest. First off, we have the Bowkick Compound Bow. The Bowkick is another very interesting marksman weapon as it comes out of the care package, but it comes with 60 backup arrows, making it very worthwhile to pick up. Like the Sentinel, it has a Deadeyes tempo built in, which rewards you for consecutive shots and has a damage per second of 105 to 129 or 75 to 107 if you're using the Shatter Caps. It's the 2nd highest damage per second for a long-range weapon, and 60 arrows is enough to last a whole game while saving you inventory space for other valuable things. Consider using the Bowkick if you're carrying a sniper or marksman rifle and are heading into a late game. So let's move on with the Car SMG, which actually did receive a nerf this season, but if I'm going to be honest, it kind of didn't do anything. For those unaware, the car did receive a nerf to its ammo capacity, bringing it down by 1 bullet per magazine, so now having 19 bullets on stock and 26 with a purple magazine. But the thing is, the car has a really high damage per bullet, and 19 or well 26 is well more than enough to hit a 1 clip. Since at 13 damage per shot, assuming you hit 100% of the bullets without a magazine, you can easily do 247 damage without a magazine at a whopping damage per second of 202. Again, this is higher than the Nemesis fully charged. Adding the fact that you can slap a digital threat on it, and you can use both light and heavy ammo and attachments, I definitely abuse this weapon if I get a chance this season. Another A-tier weapon that I've always rated very highly despite you guys in the comments. By the way, if you find yourself disagreeing with any of my takes, feel free to drop that disagreement in the comments. Anyways, that is the Wingman. While a high-skilled gun, it is incredibly efficient when it comes to ammo and inventory management, and you can get away with a few stacks to last you an entire game while not taking up your entire inventory space. You can use the Wingman as a long-range poke weapon, close range, and you can also do overall flashy shots at a solid 117 damage per second. Which isn't a lot necessarily, but since it is a single-shot weapon, it allows you to play cover and avoid exposing yourself from trading any significant damage. And closing out the A tier is a weapon I'd never expect to see all the way up here, and the last time it was considered good, ACU was still playing Apex Legends. The Hemlock entered the care package this season with a massive buff, turning it into a consistent version of the Nemesis, and one could argue, and I guess I do by putting it a tier above, that it's actually better than the Nemesis. While the DPS is lower than the Nemesis at 169, it has a significantly higher damage per bullet, clocking in at 23 damage per body shot and 40 damage per headshot. It also only fires 3 bullets per burst, meaning that's less for you to compensate for. Not only that, but the Hemlock comes with a boosted loader, adding up to 9 more bullets on top of the magazine if reloaded when it's nearly depleted. Since it is a care package weapon, it comes with 210 ammo that you don't have to carry in your inventory, and you can poke and melt enemies without having to worry about charging it up for nice, solid, easy to control damage. And finally, let's take a look at the S tier for this season. And speaking of S, if you guys have enjoyed the video so far, make sure that you've hit the subscribe button before I blow your pants off with the best weapons to use in Season 16. Starting off with those, we have the Kraber, which I have placed on the lower end in a lot of tier lists, but it's actually found its place as an S tier gun. While the chance to get a one-shot kill is significantly reduced in previous seasons, especially in late game versus good armors and helmets, that instant 140 to over 200 damage potential is enough to get an entry into a fight and engage with an insane health advantage. There's also a massive psychological factor to it, where a team getting chunked by a Kraber will scramble to reset and hide as soon as possible. And even though it has limited ammunition and is hard to use, the ability to potentially send someone straight back to the lobby with the press of a button is just too good to pass up on. Moving on is an absolutely insane weapon which didn't even receive any changes this season. The RE45 is a fight winner of a care package weapon, especially in the hands of an especially good tracker, or I guess controller player, and has a damage per second of 234 against shielded targets and 182 once they're cracked. One magazine of this SMG pistol can contain up to 400 shield damage, meaning you could theoretically crack the entire enemy team with one magazine, with bullets left to go, and then clean up with your secondary, or leave your teammates to it. Getting cracked is a huge disadvantage in any teamfight, as you are more susceptible to aim flinch, getting stunned, and other side effects, not to mention the mental aspect of playing without a shield, which makes that one of the best ways to open up a fight in the game. But the problem with the RE45 is that it has limited ammunition, and it thrives against armored opponents, which is only half of the enemy's health pool. The true king, the S tier of the S tier weapon this season, will easily have to be the R99, which now deals 1 more damage per bullet. Now, hear me out. 1 damage per bullet doesn't seem like a lot, but once you start thinking about how high its rate of fire is, you might realize that adding 1 more damage per bullet means that it goes from a damage per second of 198, which was already kind of high, to 216. You don't need any attachments, you don't need a turbocharger, it doesn't have to come out of the care package. Actually, it is just as good as the care package version of it. You just pick up this weapon from the get-go and beam. It's probably the highest DPS of any ground loot weapon without special quirks in the Apex history. Not only that, but it can be equipped with a digital threat in what could be a Bangalore heavy meta, which is obviously a huge plus. The The only downside of the R99 is that you need a decent magazine to keep a consistent damage output, and that it does require some recoil control to actually deal damage over medium to longer ranges. But trust me on this, it's not that hard to learn. If you guys want to learn more about the must-pick legends this season, check out the video on the screen. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Me me mamo mo me mamo me me mamo mo me me mamo me me mamo mo.